Hello, everyone. We're back with the SAPIEN podcast. We took a little break here. We're back with Dr. Gary. I kind of bounced back and forth between Peak Human and SAPIEN, the Food Lies film, doing all kinds of stuff. There's never a dull moment around here, and we do things when we can. So we're back with some more episodes. This one was with Dr. Sean O'Mara, who's been on Peak Human before, and Dr. Gary wanted to have him on, and we had a lot of new questions for him. So I'll let Dr. Gary introduce him a little bit more.
Yes. Welcome back, everybody. And nice to see you again, Brian. I know you've got a million things going on, and it's super fun to watch it all progress. Guys, another great one today. So Dr. O'Mara was originally on Peak Human podcast, and he talked about, metabolic health, but specifically his work in visceral fat and understanding how visceral fat is potentially a biomarker for your overall metabolic health and really your overall health. I thought it was such a fascinating concept, and his work is so fascinating using MRI machines to measure visceral fat and then create kind of prognoses and essentially a better understanding of the patient's health using this imaging. I had a million questions after your podcast, Brian. It was such to me, it's a very exciting new tool that we're going to have in the future. And I had a ton of questions that I think our listeners will really love, because I think there's a lot of practical application of his work. And I think it's something that will not only empower physicians, but patients to better understand their health. Dr. O'Mara is a special guy. He graduated with a law degree. He then went back to medical school, works with the U.S. Army Corps, has a private practice, and operates a research lab, which he speaks about in the podcast in more detail. He's a really inspirational guy. I think he's really pushing the limit of what we as physicians can do to guide our patients as they, heal from their metabolic disease. And I think that this episode is going to be very, very interesting to all of our listeners and to anyone that wants to understand how to get more information about their body, for lack of a complicated answer. That's, I think, really what Dr. O'Mara is bringing to the table.
Well, yeah, how to optimize humans. It's like the peak human. He's trying to create peak humans, and he's doing it in himself. He's great at doing the self experimentation. Like, he has probably the lowest visceral fat of anyone his age around. He's, helping other doctors learn about this. He's helping people find out their visceral fat and their health without even getting the MRI, because it's pretty expensive. So there's different ways he talks about of just measuring your visceral fat, or sort of a proxy for that. So we won't give it all away. We'll let him do some of the talking here in this episode. Another great one, great guy. So before we start, I just want to let everyone know about Dr. Gary's Evolve Healthcare. We've talked about it a lot here. You can see him online. If you're in the Los Angeles area, you can go see him in person. And yeah, I'd recommend it highly. Everyone has a good experience with Dr. Gary. I call him the coolest doctor in America. I don't know if I've ever told you that so far.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I gotta thank everyone. It's been so amazing to see everyone coming out to the clinic and reaching out to me from far and wide, doing telemedicine consults and all that. I've got some fun stuff coming up. We're working on a SAPIEN product line, different than Brian's nose to tail. I'm a big proponent of basic supplements, things like vitamin D, magnesium, B vitamins, and stay tuned. You guys will get some information about that. But at this moment, Brian Sanders has the amazing Nose to Tail brand, nosetotatail.org. He is selling some of the highest quality meat on the market. He's working with regenerative agriculture farmers and providing you guys with not just excellent meat products. He's got some great skincare products. And did those seasonings come out? I haven't had a chance to try those yet.
Oh man, the seasonings. Yeah, we got the new labels, new everything these days with body care and seasonings. The seasoning I use every day. I make my own ranch dressing out of the ranch one with yogurt. All you need is two ingredients. It's so good.
I love it. I need that. I have been lacking in my nose to tail orders, so that's coming up here, Brian. I'll be hitting you up. But anyway, I'm really excited, Dr. O'Mara. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you love the show.
Absolutely. Go to sapien.org, go to evolvehealthcare.com, and go to nosetail.org. Hello, everyone. We're back for the Sapien podcast. We got Dr. Sean O'Mara. How's it going?
Going good. How are you, Brian? How are you, Gary?
I am great. I am so happy to talk to you, Sean. We've been communicating a bit about your work, and man, I really want to incorporate everything you're going to talk about today in my practice. That's really my goal, because I think what you're doing is so, so important.
Yeah. Well, I'm always excited to share what I think are better metrics and targets for us to look at to improve health. And if we're going to overcome the tremendous system that's working to really keep, in my opinion, keep people diseased so that they become profitable for that same system, then we're going to have to come up with more effective strategies. And we know in large part what you got to do to be healthy. You got to stop eating processed foods. But now I think it's important that we give people, and starting with physicians and personal trainers, everybody, health coaches, targets that they need to be aware of so that they can get that feedback beyond just I feel better and I'm can lift more weights. What could we look at that objectively tells us that a Homo sapien, a human being, is improving their health? And I think there are a lot of them. So I'm excited to share with you today. Brian and I had an earlier podcast. We talked about some of these, but there are a lot, and I'm excited that you, as a physician, want to learn more, because I think that's going to help with a trend across our country and hopefully across the globe to better educate physicians about these new tools, and in turn their patients and their clients, whoever they might be.
Absolutely. And at this time, I mean, my best measures in my clinic and in my practice with patients are lab results. And I follow a series of labs that I think are pretty meaningful, but they're very limited. Lab work is very limited, and to have something that people can look at, that they can interpret themselves, is a tool that is missing in sort of my arsenal. Before we get into all that, Sean, I know a lot of listeners on the Sapien podcast aren't yet familiar with you. Can you give us a brief intro so they know who we're talking to?
Sure. So my background is I'm formally trained in emergency medicine. So I did 4 years of residency training in emergency medicine through the Army, and so my background is really pretty non-traditional for a physician in the space that I am in today. So about 11, 10, 12, about 11 years ago, I met a really healthy patient who told me about dietary strategies to become more healthy. And at that time, I was overweight, and I was terrified of fat, and was drinking, literally walking around the ER drinking a gallon of chocolate skim milk a day, thinking that I was healthy while I was putting on this big gut. And so I decided to cut out dietary carbohydrates, and I had a lot of medical problems. And a big one was an enlarged prostate, where urine would just dribble out of me, and I was getting up 4 or 5 times a night, and I was super frustrated, and it just went from a stream to just a dribble. And after this young guy never told me that, hey, if you do these things, medical problems will get away. He just told me you'll lose weight. So I jumped on it, and I cut out carbohydrates, and within it was somewhere around 8 to 10 months or so, I noticed I never forget, I was peeing in my toilet, standing up peeing, and it was shooting out like how I used to when I was a teenager. And I realized slowly that had completely left me, and I was no longer having to get up at night. And I just was furious. I mean, I really, really, truly was pissed off, because I was like, why does this young kid tell me about this? And then I suddenly get better when I'm going to all these doctors and, have medical degrees and all these medications, and I wasn't getting better. So I purposed at that time to try to figure out how in the world that happened. So, I went from being an emergency medicine doctor to researching this. And I found a research practice that was looking using an MRI to take a look at changes inside. So that's how I got started and did research in a research practice in Minneapolis with another MD who was also a PhD and had a lot of real formal training and experience in research. And so it brings me up to, using this, MRI and your comments early on. So most physicians are like you, Gary. They look at labs, and that's what we do in the emergency room. We also looked at, X-rays and CT scans to take a look for disease, but it's always disease. And so it's been my experience since I've shared working with patients to try to get them optimally healthy that we got to go beyond just numeric data. So, these laboratory studies that we get are just numbers. And it's sort of like the analogy I like to give is like for the podcast community, it's like, what if we used a financial model, an illustration like cryptocurrency? A lot of people have a lot of monetary value in crypto, but how is it really affected in their life? Maybe it went up. It doesn't unless it gets reduced into a house, a car, a boat, motorcycle, property, better food, whatever. If I show you a bunch of numbers, that doesn't resonate as much as if I start dropping gold coins, new car, new house in front of you, that's going to engage your senses. So if you want to improve people, get them better, I think we have to go beyond this notion of numbers and show them things that engage the senses. So I like the MRI because it gives you a visual appreciation. But most people's experience with an MRI and a CT is that the physician interprets it for them, the radiologist. And so what we have to start doing is showing patients, giving them information that they interpret. And I had an experience, lots of experience, thousands of cases where I showed this incredible marker inside the body of visceral fat, and how most of my patients that I would scan were more visceral fat inside than they were healthy tissue. And so I remember one patient who literally passed out. He syncopized on me looking at the amount of visceral fat in him. And, I've reflected on the experience a lot. And what I've come to the conclusion is that had a much more dramatic impact on him. You could take the most dramatic laboratory numbers possible, Gary, and show it to somebody, and you're never going to get them to pass out. It's just not going to happen. But if you show them, large chunk of fat around their heart, a huge contrast between their normal healthy viscera surrounded by an ocean of visceral fat, then they don't have to go to medical school to be able to interpret that and understand it. So I'm super excited that you're interested in finding out about that, because I'm confident that once you start applying visceral fat as one biomarker and biometric to follow, you're going to find quickly that your patients are just going to interpret that, understand it, and they're going to be much more open to and responsive to changing their lives, telling what they got to do to get rid of visceral fat and enjoy better health.
I muted you, Gary, but this is so great because no one really knows about visceral fat. So that's why I want you to explain to the audience really quick about visceral fat. And I'm also going to point everyone to the first 2 episodes I did with you on Peak Human. We did the second one with video, and you showed a lot of these scans. So you can go on the Food Lies YouTube channel and see what we're talking about, the visceral fat in and around the organs. It's a cross section of the abdomen. Super powerful stuff. So yeah, definitely look at that. You can press pause, go look at that, because we have no visuals for this podcast. Or you can, follow Dr. Sean on Instagram, and you can find some of his stuff there. And I'll let you kind of explain a little more about visceral fat.
Yeah. So visceral fat, you're right. Most people don't know anything about it. You can see mention of it in social media. in on the internet. Sometimes it's called euphemistically deep belly fat, the abdominal fat, the bad fat. And so I always am now recently telling people, don't take my word for it. Just Google, visceral fat, comma, dangerous, visceral fat, comma, harmful, and go out, open source it, and see all of the references, the articles, and studies to look at it. And as abundant as there are, it's plentiful, and its content out there. Most people don't know very much about it. So first of all, how much do you want? You don't want any of it. I mean, it secretes cytokines, inflammatory substances. I've seen some people say, well, it helps to confer protection, from a fall or something. No, no. If that was the case, nature would put something in there that doesn't cause inflammation throughout the body. I mean, nature doesn't make mistakes when you live properly. So your body is not going to ever put an inflammatory substance in there that secretes cytokines and contributes and is causally and socially through association related to chronic disease. So it was my experience, studying this interesting biomarkers as I learned about it first in 2013, that in scanning almost 6,000 people, every form of chronic disease that was present in those people uh, improved or went completely away with the elimination of visceral fat. Let me say it again. It improved or went completely away with visceral
Mm.
fat. So if you're listening today and you're a doctor, you're a health coach, you're a health enthusiast, you're somebody who's just interested in improving your health, what do you know that you could possibly follow that, as it goes away, completely eliminates chronic disease or makes it better in every single case? I don't know of anything as good as visceral fat. So visceral fat is really bad. It's associated with the biggest killers of chronic disease of humans today, which are heart attacks and strokes and cancer. So, recently, since our last podcast, Brian, there was an interesting study that came out and showed the connection with cancer, that this visceral fat literally becomes this sponge for TNF, NK killer T cells, that literally go out and scavenge and look around for cancers to eliminate them. We know from studies that everybody has cancer, but it's our immunity, our cells, these killer T cells that go out and correct and kill that cancer before it becomes a problem. And so these surveillance cells that go out and do this with visceral fat, they're sequestered. They're stored in the visceral fat. It becomes this sponge that sucks it up instead of going out and attacking these cancers. So, we're starting to learn more and more. It's not just the inflammatory molecules, the cytokines, and substances that get released by visceral fat and cause harm. It's the very nature of visceral fat sucking it up. So I like to say, when I explain visceral fat, to confuse some of or clear up some of the confusion that people have about the different types of fats. So there's also subcutaneous fat. So subcutaneous fat is the kind of fat that you can pinch in your, people might pinch a lower, you might pinch your abdomen to feel how much subcutaneous fat you have. So subcutaneous fat is the layer of fat directly underneath your skin. And visceral fat is the fatty adipose tissue that's behind your peritoneum, within your abdominal cavity. And so there are worlds of difference between the two. Subcutaneous fat, when we saw it being eliminated, really had no impact on chronic disease. We didn't see much impact on the existing chronic disease that was present in clients. Certainly not to the extent that we see improvement in chronic disease when visceral fat was eliminated. So the subcutaneous fat is more just extra energy store, but it's not metabolically active in the same way that visceral fat is, where we see these inflammatory substances being released from visceral fat. We just don't see in subcutaneous fat. And then there's other bad fats we learned about too, is pericardial fat, fat around the heart, and it corresponds to the amount of visceral fat you have. So as visceral fat is eliminated, this highly inflammatory chunk of fat around the heart is also eliminated. And then another area of fat, Brian, that we didn't talk about, we didn't show in images, but I have it. Thank you for mentioning my Instagram account because I have some pictures there, is fatty deposition within the skeletal muscle. So I think I did show human marbling, but now I do cross sections of MRIs through people's legs because they're some of the largest skeletal muscle bodies tissue in the human frame or in the lower extremities. So you can see these very nice clear cut of images of the skeletal muscle, and infiltrating this beautiful muscle are these white fatty streaks that really are tantamount to what humans see when they go to a meat counter and they see steaks with all this marbling. And guess what causes the marbling in those cows? Carbohydrates, an unnatural diet, a diet that's not specific to that particular species. Cows are ruminants that eat grass. They don't eat grains. They will eat grains if you give them to them, but when they eat these grains, omega 6s, they get this inflammatory deposition of fat, marbling that might taste good. It might be marketed, by, the different meat purveyors, but it's an example of inflammation in those cows. And so grass-fed cows have much leaner muscle tissue. And so do humans that eat an appropriately specific diet to Homo sapiens that they should be eating. They don't
Right.
get these inflammatory markers. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so it's an exciting area. So I hope to get Gary and any other physician or provider out there listening is to understand, looking at visceral fat, looking at pericardial fat, and then looking at these deposition within the legs. And you begin to understand now why older people, when they have this visceral fat, it's not detected, continues to lay down their muscles become weaker. And then they get sarcopenia. And so, sarcopenia is another scourge that's affecting our country, and doctors do precious little about it. I mean, they tell people to lift weights, but there's that's helpful. But we see studies that even though people continue to lift weights, even in their older years, they continue to also get sarcopenia. So there's more than just a lack of lifting weights. It is really this inflammatory process that I think starts with visceral fat and then also culminates in a deposition of fat within the muscles, and also related to this, decreasing blood flow. As we see the same muscle tissues in the skeletal muscle, we see that process being duplicated in the smooth muscle. So I like to tell my clients, before you can start working on your skeletal muscle and showing off, the mass and the growth in skeletal muscle, you should really be looking at smooth muscle, which line your arteries and veins and capillary beds to optimize the delivery of nutrients to those end organs, the skeletal muscle, your heart, your kidneys, your liver, and that ultimately continues to maintain your body. So we really have to look holistically at the human body instead of just this objective to lose weight. It's sort of like if you're trying to lose weight and you think you're going to get healthy just myopically looking at losing weight, it's sort of like starting kindergarten and only studying English until you finish college. Yeah, you might have figured out weight loss or might have figured out
Uh-oh.
English, but you never did
Did we lose
math,
Sean?
It cut
econ,
out.
physics, biology. A lot more to education,
Yeah.
a lot more to health.
Oh, it cut out as soon as you said it's kindergarten and only learn English until college. Can you
Yeah.
repeat that part?
Yeah. So, the example I like to give to people that are objecting, their objective is to approach health by losing weight, is sort of like starting school in kindergarten, and your objective is to study English, and that's all you learn throughout your entire education process. You may have learned education, but you never learned math and science and biology and economics and history and physics. So in chemistry, there's so much more to education than just English. And so too when it comes to health. But no surprise that when you take this myopic approach that majority of people take just to simply lose weight and track a number, that they're getting poor results when it comes to health. Health is life, and it's decisions that you make throughout your day, throughout your life, that transcend simply a number on a scale. And so as a health and performance optimizing physician, I like to educate my clients about the need to look at many things to help them be motivated, have insights about the decisions they really make throughout the day. And so, yeah, I think we got to look a lot more than just a bathroom scale number or a scale in some physician's office.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's why what you're doing is so important because so many of the challenging patients or the challenges I face is patients want to understand why I think they're unhealthy. And sometimes it's obvious because they look unhealthy, but sometimes they don't, right? And I think it's this myopic view of like obesity and just a BMI number that really gets people going down a wrong path because they get fixated on their BMI or they get fixated on their total cholesterol or even like their blood sugar, right? Everything, when I explain to patients, and I think why people enjoy doing SAPIEN consults with me, which thank you everyone listening. It's so flattering, people around the country reaching out to me to get a second opinion. And what do I really do though? I analyze blood work. I've spent the last whatever 7 years re-educating myself on how to analyze blood work, incorporating markers like fasting insulin and CRP, and reinterpreting the lipid panel so that I could give people objective guidance as to how they're getting healthier. And I try to go deep with them on that level. But it's hard. It's very hard to explain a complicated metabolic pattern that includes, gosh, ten biomarkers and that I look at over time that change in different rates. So one may improve, right? Your HDL might improve, but you might not be seeing other changes, and it takes time. So what Dr. O'Mara, what you're offering, when you can show someone a visual representation of their health or lack thereof, right? Something that is obvious to, like you said, you don't have to be a doctor, right? You can just look and you can see these fatty depositions. And what I think that's going to do is not only give people something that they can really wrap their head around to see how they're progressing or to see why they need to make a change, but rather like patients come to me, they're these skinny fat people, or patients come to me whose BMIs are really good and their HDL is 30, and I'm worried about them because their CRP is 6, and then they don't understand. And they're like, what do you mean I have inflammation? I'm skinny, I work out. And I'm like, yeah, but all you're eating is carbs and you have a bad metabolism. It doesn't work and you're going to get sick. And that's why you have asthma and you have all these inflammatory conditions. So I'm excited because I've never seen another tool in the health space that's so simple. It's simple as getting a scan and looking with your eyes. You don't need to be a scientist. You can just see this stuff. And it makes sense. It makes sense to anyone that when you have fat wrapping around your heart, or when your muscles in your legs are penetrated by fat, it's not good, right? Like, I think that's so obvious. It's such a common sense thing compared to explaining to someone what an elevated CRP means and why having a low HDL and a high triglyceride, why that is metabolically not healthy, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, that's a pretty complicated thing. And most people just want something simple. So the work you're doing is so powerful. I have a bunch of questions for you.
Yeah.
So let me just lay out some questions that I have, and then maybe you can get into it and how it makes sense to you. So one is,
as you're seeing these changes, as people make the lifestyle changes that we recommend, which is obviously a low carbohydrate diet, intermittent fasting, high protein diet, embracing fat, focusing on whole foods, not processed foods, the SAPIEN diet concept, something that we all agree on. Like, I see patterns. For example, the CRPs come down, those HDL triglyceride ratios improve, the A1C comes down. You even see changes in the CBC, like the RDW starts normalizing to 12.5, which is a really fun marker that I look at, and there's a bunch of evidence. But again, it's something so complicated for people to really grasp their head around. Do you see? Do you have data that shows those correlations of the visceral fat coming down, the lesions in the brain, like hopefully you could talk about that, the brain plaques, the plaques in the arteries in the brain improving. Do you see that correlate with the improvement of the triglyceride HDL ratio, the dropping of the CRP, or were you mostly focused on the changes on the fat on the imaging?
So it really is confirmatory. I mean, in terms of laboratory studies, but I'll be honest with you, I think it's been 3 years since I ordered a laboratory study because I would order them, but it never seemed to. I mean, it just didn't make a difference. If it was, they teach us in medical school, if it's not going to matter, why get the test? But it mattered to me, and I would see it, but it didn't matter to the client and patient. And I'm like, why am I getting this? Because all I did was look at and say, this means this, it supports that. So it was kind of confirmatory. But now I like to pay attention to really visceral fat and illustrations and studies and biomarkers that the patient can follow and interpret without having to have a medical degree or insight, sophisticated insight to understand. I mean, they just get it. Like the one guy that passed out, and people that are really healthy, they see that it's equally, affirming to them. But, the interesting thing that I found in limiting visceral fat is it seemed to expedite people's change in their lifestyle to give up processed foods more powerfully than any lab study. So I have paid attention to visceral fat since 2013, and it's been my experience when you share this interesting biomarker with people and they purpose to eliminate it. So they start with a baseline, they undergo lifestyle changes, strategies, first and foremostly cutting out processed foods, and then they start repeat this MRI scan, and they continue it. It supports their decision and commitment to that lifestyle change. And then some really interesting things happen that I think I'll share with you and your audience to have you share with them in turn, because I think it's far more powerful. Instead of laying down triglycerides and HDL, which as far as labs goes, I think they're really, really awesome. Or even looking at CRP or homocysteine or fasting insulin, different levels, numerous different studies you could take a look at. What really impacts people is how muscle tissue hangs on the frame, and maybe functionally how they biologically function better. So, for instance, they want to look better and they want to perform better. But here's an interesting thing that I saw would happen with people: bowel movements change. So functionally, people now go from having a bowel movement where they're sitting on a toilet for 15 minutes trying to have a bowel movement or longer, to my clients, when they eliminate visceral fat, the smooth muscle now devoid in their gut of that inflammatory, fat that lines that smooth muscle. Now that motility of the gut is upregulated, and it results in a bowel movement of, like a child. I've got 5 kids. I've been in bathrooms, toilet training 5 kids, and kids have bowel movements in seconds. Seconds. I mean, they sit on that pot, they move their bowels, and it's done in 2 to 3 seconds. Not adults with visceral fat. You get rid of visceral fat, you eliminate that fatty infiltrates within the smooth and skeletal muscle, but especially the smooth muscle. And now my adult clients are having bowel movements to return to the way they were in childhood in about 3 to 7 seconds. Beautiful, natural bowel movements. The other interesting thing is nobody talks. I mean, doctors don't talk enough about bowel movements except for constipation and take this medication and try this. But when you have a bowel movement, the other interesting things I've seen it 5 times with my kids is, and if you're listening right now and you toilet train your kids, how many of you taught your kids to wipe their anus with toilet paper and there was nothing on the toilet paper? They're so efficient that it's a reflex. It's like animals in the wild. They don't wipe, and you look at them, they don't need to wipe. It's only one species today that needs to wipe. We've got residual stool hanging out, and it evidences a dysfunctional gut. But I'm excited that my clients and me, you can eliminate the need to have to wipe because there's no residual stool as you improve the gastric intestinal motility of the gut. The other interesting thing is with peeing. Like right now, when you go into a public bathroom, you pay attention to some older guy, middle-aged guy, hitting a urinal and passing gas. They pass gas when they urinate. My clients, as they improve their health, no longer are. I used to do that. I used to pass gas when I would go and pee. Today, no more. Never have any gas to pass. My muscles, my detrusor muscles, my pubic rectalis muscles, all function really well. I just don't have that happening. So if you're listening right now and you're a gas passer when you're peeing, you've got disease. Don't pay attention to labs. Watch that one go away. That's a true sign. I tell people health is about smells, sounds, and appearances. And the sound of this one, snorting, sounds gross because it's nature hitting our vestigial brains, telling us that guy or girl is unhealthy. So as you improve the health, no snorting, no hawking, no passing gas, no weird noises. You don't have those things to warn other people about because that disease process has eliminated. Young kids and stuff don't do that. We don't pay attention. We just think kids look cute. No, they're healthy. Adults, we think they look old. No, they're disease. When you're old, you don't have to be filled with disease. So you shouldn't be making noises. You should look good. Your muscle tissue should be impressive, well perfused, and maintained, even when you're older. And you shouldn't smell like Hades. Like I was just telling my wife yesterday, it's so nice when my kids use the toilet and have a bowel movement, it no longer smells in there. I go into the public. I just did two weeks of military service in military barracks around soldiers. The noises coming from those honeypots, people go in the bathroom, and the smells were horrific. I was like, my God, I'm not used to being around these smelly, nasty, horrific sounding human beings. And so, yeah, smells go away, sounds go away, because health it returns once you are really focusing on lifestyle to get rid of that visceral fat and the other choices necessary. So I probably have 100 of these signs to be able to share with you, Gary, over time. You can learn about them and teach them to your patients. And those are the kind of metrics I think people need to be aware of and track as evidence of improving health or declining health, as the case may be.
So how do I do it? I want to do it. I'm all in. I love it. Getting imaging studies approved by insurances are challenging. What imaging studies should I be ordering? And what should patients ask their doctor? Obviously, I want to know as a provider, what do I need to order? I already have a relationship with an imaging center in my building to do very low cost cash MRIs. I've already talked to them in anticipation of our discussion. They love it. They love what I'm doing. Getting insurances to pay for an MRI scan to assess visceral fat is unlikely. But I guess from so far, what scan should I order, and what should patients ask their doctors to get some of this information for themselves?
Yeah, so great. So first, let me say you want to get a abdominal scan. And for those people who are listening right now, and I'll just pause it to you, Gary, you're a physician. Go back and get all your patients' CT scans. Go back and pull their abdominal CTs, and you read the visceral fat, teach them about it. I've done a few Instagram postings. I'll do some more on this, but you can go to my Instagram page at Dr. Sean O'Mara and look at these CT scans. And why the heck not? Why wouldn't you go back and see it at a point in time in your patients? And indeed yourself, I've had abdominal CTs. What what was your visceral fat at that particular time? And then you can repeat it and you have an idea how that visceral fat is either increased, and the chances are it's dramatically increased compared to where it is today. So people oftentimes, I mean, we just got to go back and rethink. And what I want to try to do is turn conventional medicine on its head and start looking at these traditional images that we looked at for the purposes, singular purpose of getting people truly healthy, instead of looking for disease that we can make money off of, some procedure or prescribe some medication. So start with abdominal CT, go back and look at that and see where people are. It's fantastic. Here's the interesting thing. You'll pull that CT report, will be not a single word on reading visceral fat, even though it's the largest part of that abdominal CT image is visceral fat, and they won't even comment on it. So I'm part of a healthcare system. Well, it's actually the world's largest healthcare system, the VA, the Veteran Affairs. So I came to the VA where I work as a researcher, looking at visceral fat and trying to educate other VA providers. And I met with the chief of radiology, and they don't know how to read visceral fat, but I walked them through. I showed them images, and they said, teach me how, God bless this chief of radiology, teach me how to read visceral fat and teach all my radiologists. And I'm like, what? I'm like, isn't this sad that a dumb ER doctor is teaching radiologists about this marker? And then I realized that nobody is reading this in the healthcare system. MRI, abdominal MRIs and CTs, nobody reads it because it's not taught in medical school. That's why you and I didn't learn it in medical school. And it's not taught in radiology. So I'm just going to listen. I'm not a big conspiracy guy, but somebody needs to ask that question. Why the hell not? Why isn't this taught in medical school? This is crazy. This potentially, in my opinion, I'll stake my entire professional reputation. Nothing is more useful to study and quantify and evaluate to improve health than visceral fat. I mean, if there's something else that somebody else is listening to, you let me know and come to me. But right now, I stake my entire professional reputation on this. I've never seen, my experience in working with it for 10 years, nothing gets people, more healthy, or nothing gets them, more unhealthy than visceral fat. I mean, we really need to pay attention to it. So get an abdominal MRI scan. I say MRI because it's non-ionizing. That means, there's no radiation exposure, and you need to repeat those scans and track it. If somebody is not willing to pay out of pocket, sorry, you're not worth my time working with you. You're not motivated. Are you kidding me? All the money you're spending in Starbucks and pizza, I don't have time to explain. I'm a researcher. I look for clients that get this. They hear about visceral fat. They put it together. They said, that's going. I'm looking for seriously motivated people. Now, in your case, as a physician provider doing this full time, you could probably take the time to work through them if you're being paid for that. But I just point out to you, if you do direct primary care, or you're a physician and you got to sit there and explain things for too long for people, they're not good clients for you. I mean, you want to get them healthy. So I look for people to research, people that are very motivated to get this, because there's not as much heavy lifting. And then I can study them, and it's my purpose. And people ask, well, why do you charge money to work? And why do you only work with the most motivated? Because time is money. It's precious. I got to figure this out. I want to write a book. I intend to give my proceeds from that book away to charity that helps to educate our country about reversing chronic disease and solving the biggest problem we have. So I just suggest to you in the outset to look for people that are very motivated. It's a bad sign if they don't want to pay out of pocket and they're trying to get insurance companies to cover this. And it's a fool's errand. Insurance companies will never cover, an MRI scan looking at visceral fat. They're not at all motivated to get their patients client their insured healthy, because the best example is if you watch TV. Allstate has this commercial called the character called Mayhem. He's got bandages all over his face, and Mayhem is out there, and they create this image that you got to have insurance because it's so bad out there. Well, guess what the insurance companies want? It's so bad out there, so much disease, you got to have medical insurance. I will tell you, I foresee a country, a world where there isn't chronic disease. And we had it for 4 million years. And it's just the bad food we're doing now and the healthcare system that likes it and promotes it, because that's what sells insurance, health insurance. And you only pay, whatever ungodly amount of money you're paying for health insurance right now. If that perception is out there, there's disease everywhere and you got to protect yourself. So the reality is we get rid of visceral fat, we reverse chronic disease. Now health insurance dramatically drops in cost because the amount of disease out there doesn't warrant paying that much amount of money. So that is why health insurance companies will never take serious reversing chronic disease. They'll do free lipid tests all day long because it doesn't do crap. But visceral fat, that one really improves people's health. So if you're listening today, work with physicians. Gary, he'd be glad to help you get a visceral fat scan of your MRI. And then I would also recommend doing slices through the femurs, Gary, so you can look at fatty deposition within the skeletal muscle. And if you're able to get cuts around the heart, looking at pericardial fat, and then we call it a circle of Willis, do an MRI, the brain, non-con. I mean, you could do con, but I don't think it's really.
I wanted to, not to interrupt you, but I did want to ask. It doesn't sound like contrast would be a benefit. I think that scares people when
Yeah,
So
it does.
So a non-con MRI, if I can get the heart in there, which I think I can with at least with my imaging center, I can request for them to add some slices of the heart.
I'll tell you how to do it because I do it. You really want to break up your abdominal scan into two studies. You want to do the upper abdomen, get the liver and the heart, and then you have to move the coil up high to do that, and then the coil has to go down, which kind of amplifies the magnetic field, so you get better resolution. Then you got to go lower to capture all the visceral fat that's in the lower part of the abdomen. So I like to do both. I do two. I switched over to doing two abdominal scans now, to do an upper abdomen, a lower abdomen, to capture all that, because there's not as much visceral fat in the higher abdomen as there is in the lower abdomen. So anyway, that's what I'd recommend. And you'll get the heart, you'll get the liver when you do that, and you also get the lower pelvic regions where a lot of visceral fat hangs out too.
So really 3 scans then. So we're talking about the upper abdomen, the lower abdomen, and the femur slices. And then how often am I tracking it? How much time does a patient need to see the benefits of a lifestyle change on a visceral fat scan?
The oftentimes quoted answer is it depends on the patient, but it truly does. Why? Because how dedicated are they to eliminating processed foods, to do high intensity exercise, to de-stress, to adopt cold thermogenesis, to adopt the sauna heat use. So it really turns on what they work, how hard they work at adopting these things. And so the other scan I recommend you do is that Circle Willis, the MRI, the brain, so you can look at those lesions, because we see those opening up in months. It was just a short period of time. It's repeated. So with dramatic improvement based on the effort that is expended by that patient. And then another interesting marker, and I want to share it because I don't think I shared it with Brian when we did the first one, is when those arteries open up, those plaques flow open up, and you're eliminating those fatty infiltrates and the smooth muscles lining those arteries, then the artery is no longer hard. Okay, hardening of the artery occurs from atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease including fatty infiltrates within the walls of the arteries. So now those arteries, remember how I talked about the gut opening up and these fantastic bowel movements in 3 seconds because of the functionality of that gut, those smooth muscles. Same too with arteries. So guess what? Guess what happens? Um, Arteries open up, and now you see visible pulses throughout the body. 17 spots in my body. You can visibly see pulsations in my arteries. So the future, Gary, when we do ACLS and BLS, should be don't feel for a pulse, look for a pulse. We should be able to see a pulse. If you are listening right now and you can't see your pulses, you are diseased. You have fatty infiltrates within your arterial walls based on visceral fat going on, and watch as you eliminate that visceral fat, your pulses become visible. Super exciting.
So what am I flying to Minneapolis to be trained by you? Because I'm ready to go. Let's go. What's my next step here?
Yeah.
Because I honestly I think that in order to be an educator, right, in order to be a physician that brings this to my patients, I definitely need to see before and afters. I need to see the kind of scans. I need to see what you're looking for. So I do think that there's an education barrier for providers, such as myself, to really. And I think there's no replacement for just reps, just going through scans with you, with someone who understands this, so that I can interpret it. And while I think it's obvious you can see the fat, I want to really understand. I want to systemize how I'm looking at these things so that, well, for one, it's easy, right? Because if right now I would just start kind of like, oh, this doesn't look good or whatever. But I want to have a systematic approach the same way I look at a chest x-ray, analyzing each piece. Are you developing a protocol like that, or is it more simple than
Yeah,
that?
you don't have to, Gary. You won't have to fly to Minneapolis.
But I
Um,
want to.
I'll teach you. I'll teach you directly in person online. Now, my clients who work with me, if they won't fly to meet with me, that's another bad sign. I'm like, yeah, health is not that important. So most of my clients are from all over the country, out of state. They fly in, which evidences to me again their degree of motivation that I want to see if I'm going to spend time with them. Now, in your case, I can educate you online pretty easily what to look for and to be able to see that. And that's my goal, hopefully, with the VA, is to be able to educate our veterans. And why? Because the VA is not a for-profit model. The VA provides care to veterans. So we are really looking to improve the quality of life to veterans. And the best way to improve the quality of life for veterans is to improve their health. And to improve their health, educating them about educating primary care physicians about visceral fat, pericardial fat, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and how to use conventional imagery in a non-conventional way, just like you are chomping at the bit to be able to understand. And once you rethink that and learn this new approach, the degree to which you will be able to help your patients achieve health is going to be exponentially increased. And that's what you and I want to see in patients we work with. We want to see them getting better, not just kicking the can down the road where we just keep prescribing them more and more medicine. I mean, it's just inane that patients willingly. I don't know what, I mean, it's the only healthcare system, I mean, the only consumer based system that I can think of where people go and get worse and worse results. I mean,
And
you would
still believe
never,
worse and worse
never,
results and refuse to believe that they are being messed with or that the guidelines are not right. It's so
right,
weird. It's so
right.
weird because it's so obvious.
Yeah,
And these people, and I get it, they struggle accepting that it's not even a conspiracy, that it's just the way the cookie crumbled over the last few hundred years. And it did not crumble in a healthy way. It
yeah,
crumbled. And again, we talk about it all the time. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think we have a lot of big corporations. We have a lot of history where this and that happened, and whatever fat got vilified, this got amplified. And we've talked about that a lot. I did want to comment because, first of all, thank you for your service. I think it's so important to have doctors in that space. To me, one of the highlights of my training was working at the VA because I felt that it was one of the only places where I could actually talk about trying to help people get better and not be answered with, well, how much is that going to cost? How much is this going to cost? What is this going to be covered by insurance? Because the VA ultimately is trying to help veterans. I am so excited about the work they're doing in the mental health space. They were able to start pushing forward a lot of the psychedelic and alternative kind of experiential mental health practices. Right, they're doing a ton of research on MDMA for PTSD. They have done research in ketamine therapy. They're doing research on psilocybin. To me, this is the other side of that coin because ultimately what are we struggling with the most in this country? Yes, diabetes, yes, but it's all comes from mental health problems, right? And by addressing our physical body and our mental, the mental spiritual side, that's how we're going to heal people. And the only organization that I know of that is actually doing meaningful research is the VA. So I've it holds a special place in my heart, and it's not surprising to me that, as you said, a dumb ER doctor in the VA is leading the way. It's because, one, you're on the front lines, you're seeing this stuff. Two, you have exposure to the imaging that you're using. Like a lot of primary care doctors, they're not sitting there looking at MRIs and CTs all the time. So coming from the ER space, I think that's one of the reasons. And then thirdly, the VA and working through that organization actually allows you to do something meaningful like this. Whereas I think in the private sector, it's going to be very, very costly, and any kind of university is funded heavily by drug and food companies. We know that. My medical education funded by food companies. So at no point are those food companies going to allow us to tell everyone to stop eating dietary carbohydrates, since that's the vast majority of their profits. And
Yeah.
we grow more corn, wheat, and soy in this country than we do anything else. So it's so important what you're doing, and I look forward to our next session where I'm gonna go through images with you and learn. And then when people come to me for Sapien consults, I can order these images, and we can give people some real meaningful ways to track their health and to understand why they might look healthy but are actually not healthy inside. Okay, so that was a little spiel. I do have one fun question that
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
been racking around in my brain. So there's this situation where I have people that have skeletal fat, but ultimately their blood looks great and they exercise and they're by all markers healthy. Like and sometimes it's hard to prove that because I can analyze their blood work. So and I bring up like a sumo wrestler or something like that. Have you ever had a chance to scan someone like a high performing athlete that does have a lot of body fat to show that, hey, you can have a ton of skeletal fat, but that doesn't make you unhealthy because your viscera are lean, and this is just either your body type or how you've built your body through your training? Have you played with that idea at all?
Yeah, yeah. So that skeletal muscle, I think by that you mean the subcutaneous fat. Just kind of rolls and layers of fat. And it's interesting to me that young women get these rolls of fat, and they have little teeny tiny waists. I saw this enormous pictures of these like three morbidly obese appearing females that just enormous butts and enormous thighs, but little tiny waists. And it's that adiposity that's stored in the subcutaneous realm. But when we scan people like that, they have very little visceral fat. So there appears to be a protective mechanism conferred upon females premenopausal, that they have a protection against depositing visceral fat. And their laboratory markers have been pretty healthy, and they don't have a lot of chronic disease. And people get super upset when they appear on magazines and they say fat is in and healthy and stuff like that. But there is something to this. It's really demonstrably a lot of subcutaneous fat. However, it is interesting that a study I recently revealed, and I'll share it with you, shows that same subcutaneous fat eventually releases inflammatory markers that do appear to cause a declining amount of sarcopenia. So eventually, what happens over a period of time, albeit longer, is that people start developing more sarcopenia. And so you see subcutaneous fat disappears, and particularly with menopause, you see a dramatic increase in visceral fat, and with it, a whole host of chronic disease. But for whatever reason, the subcutaneous fat for in your earlier years of life does not seem to be as destructive until you've had it for a longer period of time. And the other interesting thing that I found in data mining CT scans and MRIs is that somebody who dramatically, very suddenly develops visceral fat does not have a lot of chronic disease as much as the person that has put on visceral fat decades ago. So it's the confluence of quantity and duration of exposure that dictates the amount of consequential chronic disease. So as you go back and maybe some of your patients show you their CT scans that were either really high in visceral fat a long time ago or very little, you can see the influence of just how much that amount was and for how long, and the amount of disease that patients have. So yeah, between the two, I'd much rather have subcutaneous fat, but you don't want to have subcutaneous fat too much for too long a period of time. So I even go to the point of saying that the appearance, the hypertrophied body of a bodybuilder who's cut so much that they have like a 10 or 12 pack, I think is too dramatic, too little subcutaneous fat, that you probably want to have a layer of visceral fat. Subcutaneous fat. Don't let me say that, visceral fat. You don't want any of that, but a little bit of layer of subcutaneous fat, and that there are these extremes. The bodybuilder is an extreme, the morbidly obese person is an extreme, the anorexic is of an extreme, but probably right in the middle is kind of the Tarzan character with good muscle development, but not too much, has a lean frame and highly functional. Peas has bowel movements, climbs through windows, climbs trees, can sprint, can do lift weights pound for pound. They're very strong, across the board, but they're not a one-trick pony. Like I was impressed to hear that the guy that lifted the most amount of weights, I think, is the guy from, is it the Game of
Game of Thrones, the mountain.
Yeah. So he can lift the most amount of weights, but he can't do one pull-up, which he's kind of a dysfunctional, kind of a attribute or consequence of focusing too much on one thing. So I think health is very functionally related. You want to be able to do a lot of things, and we need to educate clients and patients about that. It goes way beyond your cholesterol panel or just laboratory studies. It's I define health, how you look, your appearance, and how you perform, your performance. So appearance and performance, in my assessment as a health and performance optimized physician, are the two most important criteria for evaluating humans and their health.
Yeah, the thing that this brings to mind, especially you were using the example of younger females with a lot of subcutaneous fat, is what is their amount of muscle mass? Because we know that muscle mass is protective, that you definitely want to have plenty of muscle mass. It's metabolically healthy. It protects you from having problems with your bones as you get older, especially for females. I do wonder if you have this situation where they're younger and they have muscle mass, but they don't train, and then as they get older, because of the lack of muscle mass, this subcutaneous fat sort of becomes unhealthy because there's not enough real muscle to protect them. And that's why I was asking about that, like the sumo wrestler who's training, who's also eating to put on fat, but these guys are not unhealthy. You don't hear them dropping dead at 40. Their cardiovascular system is in excellent shape and they have a ton of muscle mass. So I'd be curious, like what a lineman for the NFL or like a sumo wrestler, people that are training to keep fat on, but also to build muscle and build cardio. I wonder what their visceral fat situation looks like. Have you ever looked at those kind of?
Yeah, so I've looked at sumo wrestlers scans, and I see that they have, a predominance of subcutaneous fat with very little visceral fat. And then I've seen a lot of professional football players that have both subcutaneous fat and visceral fat. And interestingly, I live here in Minneapolis, and I remember it was about 3 or 4 years ago, there was an article how the conditioning coach was fired because they were having all these off field injuries from mostly linebackers who were lifting weights and tearing their pecs. And I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, they just filled with visceral fat, highly inflammatory, leaves those tendons and ligaments and muscle tissues very vulnerable to an injury. And that's what's going on. So were they eating a more healthier diet? And also, I think the area of difference most glaringly probably between a professional football player like a lineman, offensive lineman, and a professional sumo wrestler is probably the microbiome. So it's the microbiome that dictates and starts, the process by which we metabolize food in the gut. And there are a lot of people that talk about in the health space, diet and tell you can eat sugar and all this processed foods and not a problem, and they follow CECO, calories in, calorie out, but it does not take into consideration the microbiome. So it's a very, very myopic, uninformed perspective on it. And I have the greatest admiration for Dr. Peter Attia. I regard him as the single most intelligent physician, on the internet that I've ever heard. I mean, his podcast, his elucidation of technical, I mean, it's just unsurpassed. And yet he is dismissive of the microbiome, because he thinks it's just too complicated. And I think it's unfortunate that he's taken that kind of approach. If we could get Peter's mind into the microbiome and understanding the advantages it has to exploit, you don't have to wait for the entire sequence of the human microbiome to start realizing, how important the microbiome is. So, I think that's the biggest difference that I see in functionality, and then differences in terms of fat depots, whether it's going to be subcutaneous fat or visceral fat, is dietary influenced by and through the microbiome.
Yeah, and I think that's why the sumo wrestler example is so interesting, because traditional sumo wrestlers, professional sumo wrestlers, they're eating a very, very specific diet, which I've learned about, and it's very, very healthy, and it's very high in protein, healthy carbohydrates, unprocessed carbohydrates, and fermented foods. And that's really like the heart of what they're eating. So when I look at those guys, it's just an interesting sort of polarized example of like, you don't even have to look healthy, but if your diet is healthy, you're healthy inside, even though you don't look the way perhaps we expect to look if you're super healthy, right? So I just think that that's such a great example. And we know that professional football players are not following those sort of, well, at least the
Oh yeah.
majority of them, they're just American, right? They're American
Well,
guys that are big and strong. Whereas a sumo wrestler has to join these organizations. They live there. Their diets are well controlled. It's a very like it's almost like a study group in and of itself. So that's just something I've always thought about since I learned about your visceral fat thing, because I'm like, well, look, we have a population of people that are sort of have controls. We know what they're eating. We know how they're training. We know that they look different, but they appear very healthy, and you don't hear about them dying at 50 from metabolic disease, like unfortunately, so many professional football players, not just CTE. A lot of them have metabolic disease after they're done training. And anyhow, it's a fun idea to explore one day.
well, yeah, I wanted to throw in that these football players, they're very different. They can look the same. That's why it's so hard. They can look the same, because I know some of them, they do eat really clean diets, but some of them don't. Like I remember in Game Changers, they were even talking about the guys were eating Popeye's chicken before the meals. And, they have this really junk food obsession because they can get away with it. And so it's fine until it catches up to you, right? And then it's not fine. And then we have no idea what they look like. I mean, some guys like Tom Brady, I know eats a really clean diet. He's all about whole foods, and he's eating, just completely whole foods with, and they try to make him sound plant-based, but he's like, no, he's eating chicken and fish and all kinds of stuff. So you gotta like look at these. I wish we had the visceral fat scan so these guys to know how different they are. But he's proven the pudding kind of. He's still performing at such a high level, and
The
they're
The visceral fat scans are so fascinating because it sort of uncovers the truth, right? Like you could look at these guys that might be performing well, or girls, and you can see how healthy they are. Literally visualize it, and it would be so fun to do, to look at the scans compared to what their diets look like. And at least for me, I know your overlaps. At least for me, it would be super fun to see correlations between these cholesterol ratios and inflammatory markers, hormone changes, as we see the visceral fat changes. To me,
Yeah,
that
well, I
would be
encourage
really
you to do it.
powerful.
Gary, I did it for years, and I saw that it really was confirmatory how it improved the labs. So I think that would be helpful for you to maintain as long as they're being paid for and covered. But really want to reinforce that fermented food. So I have found that it's one of my protocols is to give people fermented foods and get them exposed to and acquainted with eating fermented foods. But it helps to accelerate the loss of visceral fat, I think, through upregulation of that metabolism. So, what's interesting to me, and I realize it's kind of sad, but as a big a proponent I am of the microbiome, I recently got an Invisalign, and I was concerned about putting this Invisalign thing in my teeth, kind of straighten out my teeth, and because I was concerned that it's a foreign object and becomes a nidus for bad bacteria to grow in. And in fact, it did turn out to be the case that I noticed, some bleeding when I started was flossing that I never bleed. And so it had this unhealthy contribution. Then it occurred to me that the reality is when you are chewing and you have this bacterial, bad pathogenic microbes in your mouth, and we've seen these people with horrific dentition, especially in the ER. They have apical caps, with abscesses, and their, pus is coming out of their mouths. They're freaking eating meat. And if you got even any degrees of pharyngitis or gingivitis and bad bacteria in your teeth and your mouth and your tongue coated with and then you're chewing this meat and then you're swallowing it. My God, you're just introducing this, gross, bad bacteria into this food bowl that's going down into your gut. And then that's where you're supposed to be healthy. So here's a really cool illustration. You want to be blown away? You want the best example of the microbiome? I came up with this 2 days ago. This is literally what happens. You take 2 jars, with a lock container on it, with a clamp thing on it to tighten it up. You put 2 types of food in that, okay? One, you put good bacteria, maybe lactobacillus to help it ferment appropriately. The other one, you take a hair from a diabetic, demented patient with obesity and chronic disease from a nursing home that wears diapers. You put that hair into that container, or you take a little tiny bit of their feces, or just some gross stuff. And you put it, and you lock that up. Then you undo that in 2 weeks, or a few days later. The smell that's going to come out of that one, it is no different than the human gut. What are you putting in your gut? What is in there? Good bacteria or bad bacteria? So use that example to help your patients understand the critical contributory role of the microbiome. To me, that's the best example I've ever come up with. It took me 12 years, but I'm sharing it for the first time here in the Sapien Peak Human podcast.
I love it. I love it. And I want to go back to the just visceral fat being the number one thing that you said that. And I'm the layman here, but I've interviewed hundreds of people and I have to completely agree with that. Number one thing over all my interviews, this is the number one thing. I even remember my first interview with Dr. Ted Naiman. He was bringing up the visceral fat back 4 years ago, talking
Good
all
for
about
Ted.
it. So important, super important. Also want to say, with these scans, I think the hard part, we're talking about how amazing these MRI scans and all this stuff is. And people are like, so why isn't this well known? Why isn't this well known? It's cost a lot. That there is a big problem. And so I get it, that it's like, it seems like it's this magical thing, and it makes sense why we can't do it. So there is a reason why, this isn't everywhere. So
Yeah, it's cost, but it really gets back to knowledge too, Brian. I mean, just radiologists don't know how to read it. It's not commented on. Primary care doctors don't know how to read it. They don't even know how to get rid of it. The nonsense I see on the internet telling people to eat 6 to 8 servings of grains a day to get rid of visceral fat. I'm like, oh my God, we've got to save our country from this bad knowledge out there. So that's why I was really excited to come on your podcast and talk to Gary about this and to educate people about it. But to whet your appetite a little bit, I actually, as much as I use MRI scans to look at visceral fat, I predict a future we're not going to do that. And what I have noticed over 5 to 6,000 scans is I see a change in the abdomen. People who have certain characteristics on their abdominal gross exam when I get their shirt off, evidence high amount of visceral fat, and when I scan it, it's confirmatory, and other characteristics for low amounts of visceral fat. So I think for 4 million years, we didn't have an MRI scan. We didn't have labs. So the MRI scan is just helpful to educate providers and patients right now, but we've got to get away from the dad bod. I mean, people are thinking the dad bod is attractive and good, and it's not. Even bodybuilders now have these protuberant abdomens. They call it the tortoise shell. And they even feel like it needs to be a new criteria to score higher bodybuilders more points if they have this bulging abdomen. And what it is visceral fat underneath it. They have a bulging abdomen, their abdominis rectus stick out, their obliques stick out because of the displacement of accumulating visceral fat, oftentimes accelerated by abuse of anabolic steroids, growth hormone, and exogenous insulin. And in addition to maybe less pathogenic, but still pathogenic, is consumption of high carbs. Bodybuilders' dependency on bulking. They take all these high amounts of, and unfortunately, it leads to deposition of visceral fat. It starts accumulating more and more. So the future is, I think, we're going to look at bodies. We need to know what is a healthy looking body, what is an abdominal scan. Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was competing, has a very, very tight little waist. He didn't have much visceral fat, but the bodybuilders today are starting to have more of a protuberant tortoiseshell abdomen. And I was just amazed to read that people in the industry think that we should replace that tight abdomen with the vacuum pose where you could suck it in, replace it with these protuberant abs and big lateral oblique folds. So I know you and I have talked about this offline, but I think that is something to think about in the future. And I'm going to do a post on this where I go through a whole series of MRI scans and CT scans and coronal and sagittal planes showing all this visceral fat and these features of anterior displacement of the abdomen, lateral displacement. And it's always the case when you scan them, they have these huge amounts of visceral fat.
It is interesting in the bodybuilding world that I have a bodybuilder gentleman that I want to have on our podcast, because we were just talking about this on an Instagram live, and it seems like that industry or that sport really is getting split, where you have like your traditional bodybuilding class where they're definitely using all sorts of growth products, and their aesthetic is just big and bulky and the tortoiseshell. But now there's a kind of coming push back into this classic physique, which is what like Schwarzenegger was back when bodybuilding was starting. So there's even a section of this space where they're like, no, we want to show what healthy body looks like. So anyway, it's interesting because the bodybuilding community sort of reflects what we're talking about in how it's developing.
Well, I think they're interested because it really they want to try to get to the results, and I applaud that. And that's what, to put in a plug for Brian. Brian, I've known Brian for I guess a couple of years now, and I love his content because peak human. Whenever I talk to Brian offline, whenever any conversation, I'm always convinced that he's dedicated to try to find the healthiest form of humanity that we can get. He's genuinely interested in this, and that's why I think we need more people in the space that have that kind of an interest in it across the board. And a lot of times, sadly, it's people are about money. They're looking for some kind of way of get more followers or make more money, generate sell more products or something. But yeah, whenever I see somebody like Brian that's genuinely interested and intrigued, with trying to get people more healthy and understanding what that is, I think we got to stop and applaud that. So I'm always happy to
Mhm.
come on Peak Human and talk about it.
SAPIEN as well.
His
Yeah.
followers are really fortunate to have him providing such great content.
I appreciate that so much. And yeah, I'm trying to go what you were saying earlier. The human body that is adaptable, can do so many different things, can't just lift the most weight and not do a pull-up. That is my goal too. I want to be playing beach volleyball until I'm, 70. I want to be like Dr. Sean. Dr. Sean has a great physique. He can do so many different things. This is how a human body should look and how it should behave. And I'll give a shout out to Mark Sisson too. He's just a mentor to me, great example. He's 68 now. He's a beast. This is what we're talking about. This is how humans should be. He's out
Yeah,
there playing ultimate frisbee with 18 to 30-year-olds, beating them.
yeah,
He's jumping, he's running, he's sprinting, he's lifting weights. This is how humans should be. Very few are out there. Dr. Sean's doing it. Dr. Gary's doing it. We're all doing it. Let's go. Let's go. Let's
yeah.
get everyone
Love
fired up
shout out
about
to,
this.
Mark.
Super
Just,
fired up. Thank you
Mark
so much,
is
Sean,
great.
for joining us. I mean, I have a million more questions, so I would really, really love to do it again. But at the very least, next step, I'd love to get on a call with you and go through some images, because I think after this podcast comes out, I think people will be reaching out, and I want to be ready to help them with
Yeah,
this MRI stuff, and really incorporate visceral fat assessments as part of my metabolic assessment, which I'm always developing. They didn't teach me any of this in med school. I'm making it up as we go. So I look towards leaders like yourself, and I applaud you. I thank you. I really do. Even before we had this talk, I've been thinking about it, and I just didn't know how to apply it. So thank you.
yeah. Well, my pleasure, and thank you, Brian, for putting this together and putting this program on. And yeah, we can always do another program, because yeah, there's always stuff we don't get to cover, and I'm always learning, from my own clients that I come and study from and research from and learn so much, and I'm happy to share it back in a venue that's dedicated like Peak Human to optimizing human beings. So yeah, this is such a gift to our country. This awakening on health, that you just don't have to continue to keep taking more medication. And I'm excited that young people are tracking on this. They're interesting. You look at so many followers on Peak Human and Food Lies are young, and they're like, the hell with turning into this old guy that or old girl that looks so bad. I want to learn more, and so I think this is great that there are podcasts out there in the social media community that aren't part of the conventional healthcare system, where people can get the kind of content they need to know to actually optimize their health.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, this is going to go on Sapien podcast, by the way, not Peak Human. But thanks so much for coming on. We'll have to do a round two. And I know we got to get out of here. So we'll see you next time.
Okay, great.
Thanks,
All right,
guys.
thanks, guys.